My name's Dr. David Grummitt. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the History of Parliament Trust. For the last 5 or 6 years now, I've been working on the biographies of MPs who sat in Parliament in the 15th century. One of the key things that we look at, of course, is the relationship between the localities and the centre. And this is the subject of the lecture I'm going to be giving today. The question is, how far did Edward IV restore order on his accession in 1461? Naturally, law and order was one of the principal problems facing Edward IV on his accession to the English throne in March 1461. The previous 2 years had been characterised by open warfare between the houses of Lancaster and York, which had seen many noblemen and landowners killed, and violence on the battlefield spill out into a wider violence in the realm at large. Law and order, of course, was one of the issues that lay behind the Wars of the Roses. Certainly to a generation of historians writing in the mid-19th century, the failure of the Lancastrian kings to maintain law and order was one of the key reasons why they were replaced in 1461. Charles Plummer, writing in the 1880s, characterised the problems of the 15th century in terms of law and order as the problems of bastard feudalism. Bastard feudalism was the system by which men were recruited and kept in the affinities of great lords, not by proper feudal relationships based upon land, but by the payment of cash. These relationships based on cash, Plummer thought, were inherently less stable than those built upon land. Men could swap between the retinues of great lords, and great lords could hire retainers who they could use to overawe their opponents both at the centre, for example at Parliament, but also in the localities where they could use these armed band of retainers to subvert local justice and basically to get what they wanted by force. Modern historians have questioned Plummer's description of bastard feudalism and the inherently problematic status of these relationships between lords and their servants based upon cash payments. As we now know, nobles were absolutely crucial to the functioning of order at a local level. Nobles offered their lordship to their servants and to other landowners and arbitrated in their disputes, offering a system of justice which complemented, not undermined, the system of justice available through the King's Courts at Westminster. Thus the problems that Edward faced when he came to the throne in March 1461 were not necessarily structural, but more to do with the fact that he had inherited the throne, or seized the throne rather, in such violent circumstances. It was the legacy of the failures of Lancastrian government in the 1450s and the immediate legacy of civil war, which was the principal problem facing the new king. Edward could count on little support, really, among the English nobility. The Duke of Norfolk and the Neville family, of course, had fought alongside him, but other nobles, principally the Dukes of Buckingham, the Earl of Wiltshire, the Duke of Exeter, and many others had actually either been killed fighting for the Lancastrians or had fought on the Lancastrian side. The Duke of Somerset was in exile. The Earls of Northumberland, Devon and Wiltshire had been killed at the Battle of Towton. The Duke of Exeter and the Earl of Shrewsbury had supported Henry VI. Thus there were many nobles who stood in an ambiguous relationship with the new king. Edward needed a new nobility to run the shires on his behalf. One of the things that we see in the first decade of Yorkist rule is Edward building up a new nobility, a Yorkist nobility, that could exercise royal power on his behalf in the localities. Thus John Neville was created Lord Montague in 1464 and eventually Earl of Northumberland in 1469. William Hastings was created Lord Hastings and given regional authority in the Midlands. Sir Walter Devereux was created Lord Ferrers of Chartley and exercised a great deal of power on the Welsh marches. And in the southwest, Sir Humphrey Stafford and Sir John Dinham were also elevated to the peerage. This was a new regional nobility which were to run the shires on the king's behalf. All of this was in the future for Edward. In 1461, the immediate problem was to solve the Lancastrian resistance which was still apparent in the north of England. Henry VI was still at large, and while there was still another rival pole of royal authority, it would be very difficult, I think, for Edward to actually restore order. Edward had to tread a fine line between repression and pardon in the north. He pardoned Sir Ralph Grey and the Duke of Somerset. They were accepted back into the king's grace, but within months had reneged on those pardons, and the castles which they had held for Edward were delivered over to Margaret of Anjou and her Lancastrians. This problem of Lancastrian resistance in the north was not settled until Montague defeated Somerset at the Battle of Hexham in 1464. After that, things began to settle down, but there were still local disputes which characterised Edward's reign between 1461 and 1469. Perhaps the best known of these is the dispute in Derbyshire between Sir Richard Vernon and Lord Grey of Codnor. The Grey-Codnor dispute typifies in many ways the problems which faced Edward on his accession. This was a dispute over land and inheritance, and both sides were able to bring bands of armed retainers to threaten each other at meetings at the county court, to make raids on each other's lands, and basically to act like thugs. In 1468, Edward introduced new legislation, an act against retaining. This stopped the gentry from retaining large numbers of extra servants. Servants could only be retained if they were actually active and serving in the Lord's household, or were his retained legal counsellors. It became illegal to merely give out fees or give out badges to men who you would then employ as general thugs and generally to overawe your opponents. Edward was able to succeed in this retaining legislation of 1468 because he enjoyed the support of the political nation in Parliament. One of the most important points, I think, to make about Edward's efforts to restore order and stability in the 1460s is that there was a general feeling that the realm needed to recover from the effects of the 1450s, Lancastrian misgovernment and civil war. Edward's retaining legislation of 1468 succeeded because most of the landowners and most of the lords of the realm wanted it to succeed.